The shadow forms when we're tiny little kids and we're getting messages from all the adults around us about what's good and what's bad, what's acceptable and will bring love, and what's taboo and will bring punishment or shame or abandonment. And we learn quickly, even non-verbally. And so the material, the attitudes, the behaviors, the feelings that are not permitted or encouraged or praised get repressed into the unconscious shadow. And the shadow can contain anything. So in one family, it may be that academic performance is praised and musical talent goes into the shadow because it's not encouraged and supported. Or it may be that anger is scary, and so everybody stuffs it down and lives with a lot of repressed anger or rage, and that goes into the individual and the family shadow. Or maybe sadness or grief makes people uncomfortable. No one's allowed to cry. And so that particular energy or form of expression goes into the shadow.
Welcome to a Broaderlands podcast. The opinions expressed on Broaderlands podcasts are those of the guest speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of the host or Broaderlands podcast. Connie, welcome to Broaderlands podcast. What an honor to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I really look forward to this. I love learning from people, and I look forward to learning from you and learning more and helping us meet the shadow. It's always been a fascinating topic for me.
Good. Well, here we go.
Maybe to start off, I would love for you to maybe help us better understand the shadow. Could you begin by explaining what the shadow is and why it's important to acknowledge it, if you don't mind?
Yeah. So, in my career as a depth psychologist, I was trained to help people orient to the unconscious, orient to what is outside of our awareness that's actually driving our behavior and beliefs. What is it that's hidden from us because maybe it was shamed or forbidden or denied? And so Carl Jung, who was one of the early founders of psychoanalysis, called the unconscious, the personal unconscious, the shadow, the personal shadow, because it's outside of the light of awareness. And the shadow forms when we're tiny little kids and we're getting messages from all the adults around us about what's good and what's bad, what's acceptable and will bring love, and what's taboo and will bring punishment or shame or abandonment. And we learn quickly, even non-verbally. And so the material, the attitudes, the behaviors, the feelings that are not permitted or encouraged or praised get repressed into the unconscious shadow. And the shadow can contain anything. So in one family, it may be that academic performance is praised and musical talent goes into the shadow because it's not encouraged and supported. Or it may be that anger is scary, and so everybody stuffs it down and lives with a lot of repressed anger or rage, and that goes into the individual and the family shadow. Or maybe sadness or grief makes people uncomfortable. No one's allowed to cry. And so that particular energy or form of expression goes into the shadow. And so anything at all, it's not about, quote, just negative things that we tend to think of as negative. They're only negative in relation to the ego, right? And the ego and the shadow form in tandem. So what's permitted and encouraged goes into the ego, the conscious personality. And we become polite or kind or caregiving or smart or generous, right? Because that's what's socially accepted and praised. It brings love and acceptance. And everything else gets stuffed away into the closet inside the body mind. It's not a little closet inside the mind like we used to think about it, because now we know the body mind are intricately connected. They're really one functioning system, right? So the shadow lives in our cells, in our muscles, as well as in our feelings and in our thoughts and in our brains. And so when we begin to encounter this, all of this material that's hidden away, a lot of charge can come up. We might notice that all that energy that was stuffed down starts to return, and we may have more energy, and we may have a broader range of feeling and a deeper self-acceptance and different forms of expression that we didn't have before, and permission to behave in certain ways that we didn't have before with shadow work.
Wow, you answered my my next question was how does it are we born with it, or how does it form as a does it form when we're a young child? And you just answered my question. But you brought up a family. Can a family have their own collective shadow? And how does it affect us as individuals within the family?
So each of us is embedded in a family, which is embedded in a community or a tribe or a group, which is embedded in a nation or a culture, right? And each of those has its own shadow. So a family shadow may be Christian and upright and moral, because that's how they want people to see them. But what goes into that family shadow may be a secret. Sorry, that's like the family ego or persona, right? We're moral, well-behaved, generous Christian family. But what goes into the shadow could be anything. It could be shaming behavior. It could be sexual abuse. It could be physical punishment. But nobody knows, because the presentation to the world hides what's in the family shadow. And often family secrets are carried for generations. So some of the family shadows are inherited, great-grandparents to grandparents to parents to kids. And so through the generations, that same shadow content is carried on, unless somebody wakes up and says, you know what? I'm not going to hit my kids. I'm going to break this pattern now. I'm going to learn shadow work, and I'm going to recognize what comes up in me as I'm wanting to hit my child, like my father hit me, or silence and ice him out, or shame her as being, weak and silly girl for crying, or whatever the behavior is that's been handed down. I'm going to stop that now and break this intergenerational family shadow. And that requires self-reflection and the tools of shadow work.
Thank you. Like, if I look at my family, for an example, I've noticed that a lot of my elders in my family, no one knows how to talk about feelings or emotions or real problems. They just kind of turn the other cheek. And that's not what Jesus meant, right? But they just don't talk about it. They act like it never happened.
Right. So denial is often the first response to shadow. It's a no, can't look, don't want to know about it, can't see it, can't feel it. It's too scary, it's too unappealing, it's too gruesome, it's too dangerous, whatever the adjective is. And so denial is epidemic. We deny all kinds of things, right? We deny the climate crisis. We deny social justice issues. We deny racism. We deny, and so those are collective shadow issues that we deny. So in a family, it might be that we're denying certain feelings because we've been taught, and the next generation, they've all been taught no anger, no crying, nothing to make anybody uncomfortable. And so we live on the surface. We live in a personality, a persona, instead of in the full depth and range of who we are.
Speaking of that, like right now in America, is the shadow being? I can see the shadow really strong in America, with our leaders putting down other parties, and this party's blaming this person and these people and these people. It's the us against them, and it's like feel like so much separation, dehumanizing people, making racial gestures, and just there's a lot of hate. What's
Yeah.
can you see that collective shadow?
So, shadow projection is the other defense we use besides denial. So denial protects us from seeing the shadow in us, right, or in our family. Projection is when we unconsciously attribute those unwanted parts or feelings or actions to other people or groups. When we stereotype groups, when we feel racism or sexism, homophobia or xenophobia, right? And all these things are very up now in the collective. In the past, they weren't so fully expressed, but part of what's happened in the body politic is that certain leaders, I won't name names,
Yeah.
have weaponized shadow projection. They've weaponized it. And so now whole political parties are projecting their shadows onto groups and scapegoating and demonizing them and now deporting, acting on these shadow projections. So once you begin to have this psychological framework or broader lens, as you might call it, you can sort of see what's happening from a deeper perspective. And I think that's really important for all of us now to understand how this happened, how we got here. So, what I call tribalism is a result of the shadow projection onto groups, by groups toward other groups. My tribe is good. It's the winner. It's the right one. It's the religious one. It's the whatever it is, politically correct one. And your group or your tribe is evil or wrong or immoral or stupid, whatever the projection is. And so we live now in this tribal division where members of these groups feel so separate from each other. And this could be religions or political parties or ethnic groups or any kind of subculture. There's so many different kinds of groups in our larger society. And they're now pitted against each other the way that Democrats and Republicans are. They've lost common ground because they're projecting and demonizing the other and making enemies. Yeah.
And it's creating a divided states of America, and it's sad to see when you could see it clearly. In AA, they always say, if you spot it, you got it. But I think when the unconscious becomes conscious, enlightenment occurs, and you can understand the behaviors of others. At least I'm speaking through my own experience. And it's sad when you could see it pretty clear and others can't, and it's just causing a lot of harm, unnecessary suffering for all of us.
It's causing terrible harm. And I think that's the intention, actually. That's the intention now because, our president is a psychopath. He has no empathy. So, I think our topic today is religious and spiritual shadow, right? It's my book, Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path. But the principles that we're discussing are the same.
Yeah.
The principles are in spiritual communities or churches or synagogues or mosques, or zendos or sanghas, right? Any denomination, this mechanism of shadow projection also goes on. So we have the one way to God, and you don't. You're lost, you're going to hell, right? Or we have the guru who's the only one who's really enlightened, and yours is a phony. And so this shadow projection between religious communities is also epidemic now. And that was also weaponized by the politicians. I wrote this book because I hadn't really seen the psychology of the shadow applied in this context. And I had my own experience as a young person in my 20s of joining the TM movement, Transcendental Meditation, and watching it start out as a very open, clear-minded, kind of democratic community where people could question authority and learn and discover meditation. And I watched it become more closed-minded, where everybody started to dress the same and eat the same and talk the same with the same tone of voice. And it really disturbed me. And then I started to see hypocritical behavior in the leader of the TM movement, who was saying one thing and doing something else. And so I left. And it was heartbreaking for me to leave, as it is for everyone to leave a spiritual community. It's like leaving your family. It's devastating. And that stayed with me, that experience. And I began to see patterns. As I studied psychology, I began to see patterns in religious trauma and spiritual disillusionment that happen to people in every denomination. Not just that group, but every single denomination. And so I actually wrote my doctoral dissertation about this and studied, what is our longing for heaven, for transcendence, for awakening? What is that yearning about? And how does it lead us to transcendent experiences? And how does it lead us to getting in trouble? Why do so many priests and ministers and gurus and roshis act out their shadows? And so I spent a number of years exploring and studying this and interviewing people. And one chapter in the book just tells a whole series of stories of all of these various teachers who really created harm in their students, in their disciples, and in their communities. And I tried to understand how that could happen. If they were in advanced levels of consciousness, how could that happen? Why wasn't their shadow gone? Why was it still active? How could they be so unempathic, uncompassionate when they're teaching compassion, right? And so this book has now reached many thousands of people who've really struggled with this kind of traumatic experience and all of the symptoms that come with trauma and the heartbreak of losing their ideals and the disillusionment of losing their dreams. And the second half of the book is about spiritual shadow work. So it offers tools for people to identify their projections, because sometimes we don't just project the dark side, we also project the light. So we may fall in love with a teacher, a priest, or a guru, and imagine that he or she has what we're looking for. And we can only get it through that other person. And so we're locked in a certain dynamic now with that belief. And we're projecting our own light, our own wisdom, our own potential awakening onto this other person. And that empowers the other person to act unconsciously and to be forgiven, right? And that person could be physically abusive or verbally abusive or financially coercive or power hungry. And over and over and over again, the community members forgive or they deny. Oh no, that never happened, right? Or oh, well, he's doing that because he's enlightened and he can do no wrong. Or the church is telling him to do that, or whatever the excuse is. And so I interviewed a lot of people in these situations and tried to understand it, how the shadow in us and in our teachers and clergy can act out in these situations where they're supposed to be sacred settings. They're supposed to be the most precious contexts of our lives. And yet there's trauma happening.
And one of the examples you use in your book is with Osho, which is a very interesting story of Osho. I mean, I think he has some of the most profound writings, yet look at what happened with his movement.
Yeah, he was a genius. Very clear awareness. He got addicted to drugs and really got into all kinds of trouble. And then the community itself got a little paranoid, started collecting guns, and all kinds of things happened. So these are, that was a dramatic example. There's also the example of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche of Shambhala, whose books were also incredibly brilliant, and Adi Da, whose books were incredibly, these were genius teachers. And yet they became power hungry and believed that they were immune to consequences, which is a real symptom of narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
They all believed that nothing would happen to them no matter what they did. So, and there are women teachers who act out as well. It's not only men, but it's primarily men acting out on women. It's primarily that, but not always. So yeah, there's a whole chapter of those stories. Noah Levine. Stephen Levine's son became a Buddhist teacher and had serious struggles of his own and acted out in very shadowy ways. And it's disturbing. This is disturbing. And at the same time, as it's alarming, it's also equalizing because we realize the most brilliant people, the most spiritually advanced people still have shadows. That part of being human is that we're unconscious in certain ways of our own capacities for harm.
Mm.
We're unconscious of our own hidden, repressed material. And that's something that's just common to all humanity, regardless of level of development. So awakening does not get rid of the shadow. The shadow is as unbounded as pure consciousness. It's bottomless, it's unbounded. At the same time, if we do psychological work with the shadow, along with our spiritual practices, right? If we don't bypass our psychological, emotional work, but include it in our inner work, then we include moral development. And a lot of these teachers from Eastern traditions who were transplanted here had no teachings on moral development. One of the astounding things I heard when I was writing the book was that there was a lot of sexual abuse going on in the monasteries in Tibet and Nepal. So those boys are growing up and becoming lamas and coming here and living with that trauma, right? And maybe they don't even remember. Who knows how unconscious the trauma is. So everyone has trauma and suffering and therefore shadow material. And therefore everyone is at risk for, harming others. And it's so important from my point of view. It's a moral and a social responsibility to do shadow work. Whether you're a politician or a social activist, or a teacher, or a clergy person, or a therapist, because therapists act out too. Whatever your role, or just a parent and a family member, whatever your role, it's so important to be self-reflective and uncover, your own risks to act out badly.
I was telling Marianne Williamson, to run for president, I think one of the things you must have to do is do shadow work, some form of shadow work, and do some inner work on yourself before you even think about running for president, because you have this big responsibility, and you can easily abuse that power, if
How
you're
did
a
she
traumatized
respond to
person.
that? What did she say to that?
Oh yeah, she agreed. She was laughing.
She's not a big shadow person. That's not her orientation, at least as far as I know.
Well, I think she didn't get into detail, but we should do some kind of form of inner work.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
You talked about religious trauma. How do you define trauma and religious trauma? Because I know you bring that up in your book, really, like you said.
Um, I think it's different for different individuals. What might be traumatic for one person may not be for another person. So it could be verbal shaming or implanting fear. If you don't do this my way, you're going to go to hell. Or it could be just even a gesture, like a facial body gesture that is rejecting. Like somebody raises a doubt. I don't know if I believe that. And then the person turns away and talks to somebody else. That's an emotional abandonment. Is that trauma? Well, it might be for one person, but it might not be for another person. And that goes all the way to the clergy people who take people's money, start out tithing, and end up asking for their whole estate, so that disciple ends up with nothing, no material security. It could be physical abuse. I mean, there are teachers who are kicking and hitting their students. There's a Zen practice of hitting the meditators with a stick to keep them from falling asleep, to wake them up. Is that abuse? Is that traumatic? Right? The whole history of sex between clergy and parishioners. What is consent? I mean, obviously with child abuse, it's a different situation, but what is consent between two adults? Can a woman actually consent to having sex with her clergy person if she believes that he holds her salvation in his hands? Is consent possible? So if they have sex, is that traumatic? If she regrets it? If she can't sleep because she feels so much guilt, and yet she said yes. So you see what I'm saying? It's very complex and subtle. And we learned a lot about this from the Me Too movement, when a lot of that came out into the public around Hollywood producers and politicians and military people and all. There's still a lot of stuff about sex in the military. But it hasn't come out so much about religious and spiritual communities, except for, the Catholic priest childhood sexual abuse issue. But this goes on. This goes on in every denomination. And so, in some denominations have polygamy, and these men have multiple wives. Is that traumatic? Well, some of them adjust to it and say it's not traumatic to share your husband, and some of them hate it. So this is, I remember one of the stories in the book is about a Zen Roshi who was, I think, 101 years old when they found out he was sleeping with a student. Now, he had said that he was celibate, So from the point of view of the community, it was terribly traumatic because it was a lie.
Mhm.
If he had said, I'm not no, actually, I think he was married. I think that man was married. But so if somebody openly says, I'm having sex with women, then is it less traumatic because it's out in the open and people know than if it's a lie and it's hidden and it's hypocritical? My first teacher said he was celibate and he was sleeping with young women, students. That was traumatic to find that out, to discover that. Many people left because it was too hard to integrate that.
Yeah, thank you. I was sharing with you earlier. I think even in the 12-step community, it was hard for me, and I still go. I kind of shared about your book in a meeting last night. I shared and shared about the term your title. Basically, meeting the shadow on the spiritual path is basically what I've learned in step 4 of the 12 steps. But it was really hard because not being able to authentically express yourself or talk about, like, well, Gabor Mate, let's look at what, or Bruce Limpton said, no, that's outside issues, not being able to talk about, expand or question what Bill Wilson said, or what the big book says, that's a no-no. And you start getting shunned, kind of shamed or made fun of, or no longer, you lose friends. And that was really hard for me, and it still bothers me to this day at times, and so I just got to continue to look at that and draw awareness to see how that affects me, but
Yeah, and see if you feel safe in your group to bring it up. Tell them that it's scary for you to bring it up, that
mm,
you're afraid of being shunned or excluded or disliked, and yet you recognize that you have questions and you'd love an open dialogue. It doesn't mean you want to leave AA or say bad things about it. It means that you want to honor yourself for your own critical thinking, your independent thinking.
mm,
Because without our independent thinking, we fall into groupthink. And then we're subject to the power shadow, right? We're subject to somebody else telling us how to live, how to feel, how to think, what to do. And we lose our agency.
yeah, calling myself, not wanting to call myself an alcoholic over and over as I before I start sharing. I think that's unhealthy. But some people get offended if you don't call yourself that, because now you're trying to be different. So yeah, just trying to find my own authenticity in a groupthink setting can be hurtful, but challenging. But that's something I just got to learn how to do on my own. And like you said, maybe speak about it and be honest about it.
Yeah,
Um,
share this process that you're sharing with me. What are the risks of saying I am an alcoholic? Just bring it up as a question. Because I used to say to my patients, what is it like for you to keep saying I am a victim? What does that actually do to you, to your identity, to your sense of the past, to the person who's the perpetrator? So it's the same thing. If you say, I'm an alcoholic, you're locking in a very small identity than if you were to say, I drank too much. So bring it up as a question and see if people are, I mean, they may not be. They may be too bought in to, but then you can say, okay, I can see that I can't do that in this group, that this is a limitation of this group. And it's the same thing in any spiritual community or religious community. Sometimes you can only be open so far.
mm,
If you question the teacher, there's a risk. If you become a whistleblower about power or money or sex, there's a risk. I mean, I interviewed people who were afraid of getting killed, like you hear about Scientology, what it does to people who leave. So there's this range of retribution behaviors. I mean, we're seeing that in the political arena now, too. People are not allowed to question authority and have different opinions at the moment. It's terrifying for democracy. Yeah. Well, it's the same thing in a spiritual community. There's no democracy because the teacher's saying, this is how it is. This is reality. This is how you behave. This is the ritual when you come to a group. This is what you do. This is what you say. And, sometimes we need that for a while. That can be safe and containing for a while. And then people start to grow out of it. Mm-hmm. Right? They get what they need from that group and they start to, well, I don't want to say I'm an alcoholic anymore. And it's because there's been growth. There's some wider awareness. Or I don't want to say, I don't want to bow down to this teacher anymore. I feel like I'm martyring myself when I bow down. Or there's a secret here that reminds me of my family secret. So I recognize in this is just an example, I recognize in this community that I'm holding a secret, just like I did in my family. There was child abuse in my family. Well, guess what? There's abuse in this community, and I'm repeating this shadow pattern by not speaking out. Right? So when you begin to wake up to these insights, it's harder to just go along and obey. It's harder to obey blindly.
You're right. So what I did was I started a new meeting in a new type of format where you're asked to identify however you feel safe with identifying with. So I'll start off like whoever's leading the meeting, they'll say, I'm a grateful member of blah, 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 instead of having to say I'm an alcoholic, right? And then in the format, it's we are allowed to bring outside readings with 12-step readings, which makes it more expansive instead of try to help expand the group think instead of staying stuck in a little box.
Good for you. So, that's fabulous.
So I might have you something in your book eventually in a topic along with others, along with some lines in the big book.
Fabulous.
Yeah. So which ties us in because you have a beautiful section in your book, Meeting the Shadow and Addiction. I'd love for you to expand on that. And I love how you talked about Carl Jung. Share about that section of your book, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I'm not sure I remember what I wrote there.
I guess one of the beautiful terms you use is holy longing. You brought up the hungry ghost.
Yes. So we have, some of us, I would say most seekers, have this yearning or this longing for something more. And we don't quite know what it is at the beginning, right? It just feels kind of restless and curious and yearning for something. Many people assume it's romantic love. And so they project that longing onto a relationship. If only I had the perfect person, this would go away, right? Some people project it onto religion. If only I awaken or get saved by Jesus or, find some religious solution to this, find the right guru. And other people project it onto food. The perfect muffin is going to satisfy me, and I'll never need to eat a muffin again. It's the last carb of my life, right? It's just going to be the perfect muffin. So you can hear how this desire, this yearning, moves around to different targets. It's projected onto different targets. And sometimes it's satiated for a while, like we find a good relationship and then we're not so restless inside. But it can also be projected onto drugs and alcohol. And many people have written about this, how they're, and I think this was the conversation you referenced privately with me about Carl Jung and Bill W. They had this conversation, and Jung said to him, spirits are in some way similar to spirit. The longing for spirits is like the longing for spirit, right? So if you think of it like that, the yearning for alcohol or drugs or any kind of altered state arises from this spiritual yearning for more, more mind expansion, more transcendence, wider awareness, greater consciousness, whatever we call it. I remember Andrew Weil wrote a book about this, chocolate. Like the desire for chocolate was kind of a desire for, he likened it to indigenous cultures that use plant medicines for people to get high and experience altered states, right? Mm-hmm. So this desire for altered states is built into human history. And so it's probably built into our genetics, right? It can be traced back to very early cultures. In India, they talked about soma, and in South America, they used all kinds of plant medicines. So drugs and alcohol create these altered states. The risk, of course, is addiction and toxicity and dependence, whatever we call it, and the movement to harder drugs like opioids and heroin. So I think in this frame, in the frame of sort of spiritual longing, it's this whisper, this whispered voice in us that's right. There is more. It's correct. There is more. There is more than this kind of daily box we live in. Mm. But if we project it onto the wrong object, we get in trouble. Clearly. I mean, we have the terrible epidemic of addiction in our country, right? Terrible, painful. So that is a different way of seeing it than the disease model. It's a different way of seeing it than pathological. I think at some point it becomes pathological. I mean, I have a friend whose son is a heroin addict, and it's just a nightmare taking care of him. So I don't think he's in holy longing anymore. He's in the throes of drug addiction. And so I'm not romanticizing, and I don't want to romanticize addiction. At the same time, I'm saying that there is this part of us that is aware, that recognizes that there's something more, and that part may seek altered states in whatever way. Right now, ayahuasca and MDMA are popular.
So if I'm an alcoholic and I'm seeking a drink, can that be considered holy longing?
Yes.
Longing for. So when I first heard Carl Jung say "spiritus contra spiritum" in Latin, spirits against spirit, it made sense to me, because when I look back, and I loved how you brought up the hungry ghost, right? In the Buddhist terms, because when I experienced trauma, I started to look outwardly for solutions just to feel better, because I was uncomfortable in my own skin, right? So I was seeking other behaviors to get some kind of relief, So the first time I took a drink, I experienced that, yes. And everything, that slot machine mind stopped.
Yes.
And I became a winner, Bill Wilson, the co-founder, talks about these strange barriers between him, man and woman, were gone. And that's
Yes.
my experience. And I think that's where the addiction kicked in, because my mind and body recorded a solution. So now I'm starting to do this over and over. And the more I do that, the more the dopamine receptors become desensitized, where I'm always going to need more.
Yeah.
And Bruce Lee said something beautiful. He said, the poorer I am inwardly, the more I try to enrich my life outwardly.
Yeah.
And I'm seeking for this solution. The spirits of alcohol gave me a solution for the spiritual malady until it no longer did.
Yeah.
And then I reached a point in AA, when I come into AA, where I needed help. And now I'm telling, I have to replace it with a capital S, spirit, to help fix my problem, my addiction with spirits and the spiritual malady within me. And I have to go within. Does
So
that
do you
sound
have
about
a
right?
meditation practice?
Yeah, I used to do like Kriya Yoga early on with Yogananda, because he appeared to me through spirit. I felt some presence guiding me when I had my awakening. I never heard of the guy before, and everywhere I would go for a long period of time, someone would mention Yogananda, a guest speaker, guest reverend at a Unity Church will come and speak on Yogananda, or just so many stories about these kind of experiences happening. And I realized it was Yogananda guiding me. So I started practicing Kriya Yoga. Now I just sit quiet and I practice like what step 11 teaches me in the 12 step. Now it's more of a silent thing, and really more of a just having a conscious way of living and being more aware of my daily behaviors, and really, checking myself and really trying to understand and question things, how I reacted, and do I owe someone an amends and stuff like that. So to answer your question, I really just sit in silence now versus
Okay.
having any other types of meditation.
Okay. Well, it seems that you have some connection with Yogananda. So you might, and this is just a suggestion, I don't know if you've read all of his books. I don't know if you've ever visited any of his lake shrines, any of his centers. I don't know if you've had a full initiation into Kriya, but it seems like there's a connection. I would urge you not to refuse that call,
Yeah, thank
because
you.
that's really a privilege to have him appear to you.
Thank you. I spent a lot of time at Lake Shrine. I have a whole section, a whole shelf of all his stuff. I met a few of his original disciples, like Kriyananda, before he passed away, and
Yeah.
there was another
Okay.
lady, but I can't pronounce her name. But I appreciate it. He even told me, don't worship my self-realization.
Yes.
Focus on your own.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this was really lovely. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. I'm going to end this with a Carl Jung quote, if you don't mind.
Okay.
And Carl Jung says, there's no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Thanks for coming on and helping us
Thank
share
you.
light on that.
I invite our listeners to check out Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path if this was interesting to you, and to go to conniezweig.com if you want to see my workshops and events that are happening this year. I'm going to be teaching shadow work in a whole series of workshops, because my two earlier books, Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow, are coming out in new editions in March. So there'll be a lot of interviews and events around that. And if you're interested in following up, you can check me out on conniezweig.com.
Connie, thanks again, and thank you for all your work you do for humanity.
You too. Thank you.
Just know we out here. Know we out here working in a major way. Had to speak on it just to make a play. Any given subject, know we make a way. Time to level up on the day-to-day. Know we out here working for the greater good. Expand your mind, broaden your lens the way you should. From the stars to the galaxy to speak on spirituality. Higher understanding for the neighborhood.